Today we begin a brand new message series. The sun just wants to follow me. Today we begin a brand new message series. We just finished up a 5-week message series on the Eucharist called Break Bread, and today we begin a much shorter series, but one that's very important. We're calling it FAQ, Faith Answering Questions, and you can see the logo right up there on the TV, Faith Answering Questions. And what we're basically doing is trying to grow in our faith, and we're growing in our faith by learning or asking questions about our faith. That's really the only way to grow, is when you ask questions. Asking questions is good. You may have had a nun in Catholic school who told you to stop asking questions, just believe what she says, but that's not true. That's not how we grow in faith. We grow in faith by questioning. And so over the last several weeks, we've been asking you to submit your questions to us, and we got a number of great questions, insightful questions, tough questions. And we've been assembling those questions over the last few weeks, and this week in the homily and next week in the homily, we'll be answering some of those questions. Obviously, we can't answer all of them, but we're looking for the ones that are most common. And so we're going to start right now, and we're going to dive right in. And one of the most common questions that we got was, why do people suffer? It's a question as old as the church, as old as religion. Why do people suffer? If God is a good and loving God, if God is completely just, if God is all-powerful, why is there evil in the world? Why do people suffer? Now, atheists will give you an answer to that question if you ask them. They will tell you that either A, God does not care that you suffer, and therefore he is not a good God. Or B, God causes bad things to happen to good people randomly, and therefore God is not completely just. Or C, God is unable to prevent suffering, and therefore God is not all-powerful. It's a logical, fairly persuasive argument, but it forgets the most fundamental, one of the most fundamental qualities of God, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So there's two kinds of suffering that happen in the world, according to the church. One of them is called moral evil. Moral evil. And this happens because of the way people act toward one another. You know, since time immemorial, people have hurt one another by making bad choices. It seems like mankind's ability to find ingenious and creative ways to torture and injure and harm other people is unending. And so a lot of the evil that happens in this world, a lot of the suffering that happens to people is the result of intentional, reckless, or negligent bad actions by other people. That's what we call moral evil. You know, a young life is snuffed out by a drunk driver. Or a young woman, desperate, aborts her child to fix the problem. Or a junkie robs at gunpoint in order to get money to feed his habit. Or a molester harms a child. Or a social gossip talks about other people and tries to tear them down in order to make herself look better. Or maybe a coworker, a friend at your workplace betrays you to get a leg up in the corporation. All kinds of moral evils happen all the time. The list goes on and on. And the reason that this happens is because God has given us an incredibly important gift. It's called free will. We are made in the image of God, and therefore we have his essential attribute. We have the power to reason. We have the power to make a choice, to think through things and do one thing or do another, choose one course of action or another, to choose good or evil. We have been given that. And nobody may interfere with that. Here's what the Catechism says about that. Every human person created in the image of God, has the natural right to be recognized as a free and responsible being. It is an inalienable requirement of the dignity of the human person. And therefore, within the limits of the public order and common good, no government, no institution, no individual, not even God, has the right to interfere with your power and ability to make a free and rational decision. So, unfortunately, that power that we have to make decisions can be abused. Our freedom can be misused, and there is where the problem lies. So why does God allow it? Why does God allow it? Well, for one thing, God can bring good out of evil. This is what the Bible says. The Bible says that in everything, God works for good with those who love him. But you may say, that's okay, that's fine, but I still don't get it. Why doesn't God just stop us from making boneheaded, stupid decisions that hurt other people? Why doesn't he just intervene and stop it? And the reason is because our free will is so essential to our human dignity that it would rob us of that dignity if God interfered. And that dignity and his respect for that dignity is the fundamental quality of God that allows suffering to happen in this world. But he does it for a bigger reason, a greater purpose. He doesn't interfere because that freedom that we have gives us the ability to make the ultimate choice in life, which is whether we are going to love, serve, and obey God or not. Without that freedom, we would just be puppets. We would love, serve, honor, and obey God because we're forced to, because we're afraid not to, because we're bribed into doing it, like, oh, you're going to get, all kinds of good things if you obey God, and not because we want to, not because we've made a free choice. And so God will not interfere in our free will ever, because he wants to protect that ability for us to choose to love, serve, and obey him freely. And that, by the way, includes what Christianity calls the devil, that personification of evil in the world. The Bible calls him Satan. He has a lot of names. This is one of the questions we got, which is, why doesn't God just destroy the devil and be done with it? And it's the same answer, because the devil, as understood in the Christian tradition, is a created being. He was an angel, and angels are created by God, and they are given free will as well. They can choose to obey God or choose to rebel against God. And so, according to Christian tradition, Lucifer, Satan, Lucifer, which means light bearer, was once a beautiful angel of light. But he rebelled against God and brought about a third of the angels down with him. But God let it happen to protect free will, the ability to choose. He allowed that to happen, and he allows the devil to continue to roam about the earth in order to protect free will. Well, the gospel reading tonight is a powerful illustration of this whole thing. In the reading, Jesus is approached by some Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees, you probably know this, but the Pharisees were a bunch of street preachers. They were out on the street. They were rabbis. They were legit, but they were out with the people. They were not necessarily in the temple all that much. And the reason that they were out with the people is because they were trying to convince the people to obey the law of Moses. And there were a lot of laws to obey, and the Pharisees believed that if every Jew obeyed the law perfectly, even just for one day, then the Messiah would come and restore Israel to its greatness, and everything would be perfect. So they were out there on the streets preaching about following the law and doing this and doing that. And they were the enforcers too, and they would condemn you and tell you you're a terrible person if you weren't following the law. They were like little snoops looking to see who wasn't following the law. And so they come up to Jesus and they see his disciples not washing their hands before dinner. And this had nothing to do with germs. It had nothing to do with hygiene. They didn't know about that back then. This had to do with what's called ritual purity, being clean and holy, so to speak. Now, this all started because in the law of Moses, it is required that all priests wash their hands and their feet, and they do certain ablutions. It takes a very long time. It's very complicated before they offer a sacrifice in the temple. Because the Jews had a very strict idea that the world was divided into two realms, the holy or the unholy, the clean or the unclean, the pure or the impure, and the two could never mix, which is why they couldn't touch dead bodies, which is why women at certain times of the month were considered unclean, and you couldn't come near them, and they had to be by themselves. It was this rigid conception of the universe, of separating these two things. And the law of Moses had priests wash their hands to make sure they were ritually clean before making a sacrifice. Now that kind of makes sense. But what the Pharisees did is they extended that law to every Jew, to every meal that they ever ate. And it was very complicated, and it was very laborious, and it took a very long time. And they condemned people who did not follow that. But it was merely a tradition. They were interpreting the law that way. And so when they accused Jesus and his disciples of doing this, Jesus just fires back and he says, "You're a bunch of hypocrites. You're a bunch of showmen. All you care about is the external practices. You don't care about worshiping God from the heart." And then he turns to the people and he says this earth-shattering line. This is going to blow you away. He says this: "Nothing that enters one from outside can defile that person, but the things that come out from within are what defiled." Are you shocked? Probably not, because today we kind of understand that. But back then it was earth-shattering, because what Jesus was doing in that one sentence was he was overturning the entire Old Testament system of ritual purity, including kosher dietary laws, which the Jews still follow today. You can't eat this, you can't eat that because it's unclean. He set that all aside in that one sentence. Nothing that comes from outside can defile you. Only what comes from the inside. What Jesus was trying to make clear to people was that the Old Testament rules about purity and clean ritual cleanness were really just a symbol to teach the people about the most important goal of all, which is purity of heart. And purity of heart is the only kind of purity God cares about. Purity of heart. Now, what's interesting is that in the ancient world, the heart was not only considered the source of emotions like we have today. Like we think, when we think of the heart, we think of emotion. But it was also considered the seat of decision, where you made a decision. A person made a decision in his heart, not in his brain, in his or her heart. And so it is where, the conscience and the will and thought comes together and you make a decision. And so what Jesus is saying is that bad actions that hurt other people, moral evil, in other words, comes from a bad heart, comes from an impure heart, not from stuff outside, but from an impure heart. And so everything about moral evil is not to be blamed on God. It is not from God. God did not create it. It is our bad decisions that come from an impure heart that cause suffering in the world, or at least this kind of suffering. But you might say, wait a minute, I don't feel very free. There are so many forces above me that sort of seem to conspire that I can't make a good decision. Maybe I don't have enough information about something. The world is so uncertain. I think I'm making the right decision, but I end up not making the right decision. Or you might think, I keep trying to do the right thing, but I keep doing the wrong thing. Like maybe my temper gets in the way, or my arrogance, or whatever, my addiction gets in the way, and I keep trying to do the right thing. I don't feel very free. It seems almost like my fate is sealed. And so one of the other questions we got was, wait a minute, what about this thing called predestination? Doesn't that prevent us from making free decisions? Aren't we somehow fated to do bad things? A few nights ago, I was participating in one of our small groups here called Starting Point. And in that group, we were talking about John chapter 12. It's a fascinating passage in this Gospel of John where Jesus identifies who his betrayer will be. Judas, one of the disciples. Judas betrayed Jesus, and Jesus knew in advance, and he told the other disciples. And a question came up in the group. Did Judas really freely make that decision? Is he in hell because he really freely decided to betray God? I mean, somebody had to betray Jesus. Somebody had to betray Jesus. I mean, that was part of God's plan so that he would get arrested and go to the cross and so forth. Did he really betray Jesus willingly and freely, or was he fated to do so? It's an interesting question. But the Christian concept of fate, we don't believe in. Fate is this idea that our choices, our decisions, and the outcomes that come from those decisions are somehow beyond our control ultimately because they're destined by God. We don't believe that. We do believe in something called predestination. And in the Bible it says this about predestination. Those whom God foreknew, he also predestined. And those whom he predestined, he also called. And those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified. So there is this thing called predestination. Now, some Christians have this idea that we are somehow fated either for salvation or damnation. That God makes this decision irrespective of what we do in life or the kind of person we are, just because of his inscrutable will. It's called double predestination. And there's nothing, if you're damned to hell under this theory, there's nothing you can do to change it. It just is. You can be the best person in the world, you're still going to hell. Catholics do not believe that. We are very clear that, here's what the Catechism says, God predestines no one to go to hell. For that, you have to make a choice. You have to decide that. And so, while we do believe in predestination, we don't believe in that. How it works in the Catholic world, or the Catholic idea, is that God already knows in advance what we're going to do. Whether we're going to make good decisions in our life or whether we're going to make bad decisions in our life. And based on that foreknowledge, then our ultimate destiny is somehow decreed by God. But it's still based on our free will and what we choose to do. Judas was not fated to make that bad decision. God did not create suffering. We do that through moral evil. But the second kind of suffering is called natural evil, and that's harder to understand why God allows it. When we see a natural disaster wipe out hundreds or thousands of people, or when we see a loved one being ravaged by an illness, there's no one we can blame. We can't blame a Hitler or a mass murderer, a sadistic mass murderer, or a bumbling government official. There's no one to blame because it's the result of impersonal natural forces. So why does God allow that? Well, it kind of goes all the way back to the same reason. It's certainly not, in most cases, the result of the individual's bad decisions, the individual who is suffering. But you can trace it all the way back to the bad decisions of our forefathers, and mothers, who initially rebelled against God. Adam and Eve in Genesis and so forth. The idea is that when man fell from grace by disobeying God, so did all of the created order. And it introduced sickness and disease and natural disasters into the world. Now you could say, that's crazy, that's just crazy talk, how could that happen? But think about this. How many exploitative, greedy, selfish human acts have damaged our environment and our created world? There is a connection. And Genesis says it when God talks to Adam after he's made that terrible decision, God says to him, "Cursed be the ground before you." In other words, the whole earth will suffer because of the decisions that humankind makes. And St. Paul, in his letter to Romans, he says that all of creation is subject to futility because of our sin and is groaning to be redeemed along with humanity. So in the end, my friends, God doesn't create evil. God does not intend suffering. God does not want it. If you're suffering right now, it's not because he's punishing you or he doesn't love you or you deserve it or anything like that. God never intended suffering to be in the world. And it's true that when we suffer, we grow in character, we strengthen our character, we become more compassionate people towards others, we become more understanding to their situation. It's true that suffering offers us an opportunity to be heroic by helping others who are suffering, or if we're suffering, to bear that suffering with nobility and strength because of our faith and be a good example to others. So it does help us to become better people, but it is not intended by God or wanted by God. In the first reading today, Moses is standing on the edge of the promised land. He's not going to be able to go in. He's just led the ancient Israelites through the desert for 40 years, and he's giving them his farewell speech. And here's what he says. He says, obey God's commandments, every single one. Don't change a word. And then he goes through the whole book of Deuteronomy, and he lays out the law once again so everybody knows. And then in chapter 30, he says this. He gives them an ultimatum. I have set before you life and death. Choose life that you may live a long life in the land. In other words, obey God and you will prosper. But my friends, the mark of true and deep faith is the desire to obey, serve, and love God, even when we don't prosper, even when we suffer. I had a man who came to visit me last week, 2 weeks ago. 60-year-old man, educated, productive member of society, a good person. He'd helped the poor. He'd done all the right things. And one day, he lost the ability to walk. The doctors are still trying to figure it out. And then to add insult to injury, a few weeks later, he was the victim of a heinous crime that robbed him of his sense of security and peace and turned him into a victim. Within the space of a few months, he had experienced moral and natural evil, and he came to me and he wanted to know why. I hope something that we've said tonight, if you're suffering or a friend is suffering right now, going through a season of trials, I hope something we've said tonight maybe gives some explanation. It's not perfect, we know, but some answer to the question why. But at the end of the day, the best question is not why, but where. Where is God in my suffering? And fortunately, the answer to that is crystal clear. He is right next to you, suffering with you. And Christianity can make that claim with credibility because we believe that God, as the second reading says, is the Father of lights, and every good gift comes from him. And the most perfect gift that came down from heaven is Jesus, who suffered on the cross and took the brunt of human suffering and evil, the darkness of evil, onto himself. And so he stands next to you right now if you're suffering alongside you. Never forget that. The Lord has not abandoned you. He is with you in every moment of your pain because he is Emmanuel, God with us.